Hey guys, it's the Metalblade 5, and 5 years ago was when Koei Tecmo released their second Musou game for a Nintendo franchise with Fire Emblem Warriors. A game that, well, not a lot of people liked. And even though I very much enjoyed Warriors for what it was worth as an unpopular opinion, I still found it lacking in some notable areas which prevented it from being quite as good as what I hoped it would be upon its announcement. Feeling like a step down from their previous endeavor with the original Hyrule Warriors, which appeared so much so that they made a second Hyrule Warriors with Age of Calamity that focused exclusively on Breath of the Wild and was also met with a more positive reception. But as I finished Age of Calamity's story, an idea popped in my head where I thought it'd be really cool if they took the same approach to make another Fire Emblem Warriors game that focused solely on free houses. Just the concept alone will allow for some big improvements over the original, and the whole plot of Free Houses post-time skip lends itself to a Musou setup. However, as a result of the original's reception, this felt like a pipe dream. Until little over a year later from that moment.
You're dead. You crazy son of a bitch, you're dead.
The cycle had repeated, and cut back to present day, the results were so much better this time around, as you can guess from the title. Free Hopes ended up being even more than what I hoped it would be upon its announcement, including going further beyond with improving on the original Warriors than I expected, the extent of which I think some people might not realize at first glance. So in a vain attempt at trying to find an excuse to talk about this game, I want to go over where and how these improvements exist, to really sell how huge of a glow up this is in a manner that sounds almost like I'm being sponsored by them. I guess I wouldn't mind that much if I was, but that isn't the case. Ranging from the obvious to the obscure from what I've noticed while playing, here's all the steps in the right direction that Fire Emblem Warriors Free Hopes took. Oh, and spoilers, obviously. So I think the best place to start when talking about improvements would be in regards to the biggest criticism that the original Warriors received. Its roster. Warriors chose to focus its roster on 3 games in the series, with 2 unlockable characters being from elsewhere, thus leaving out plenty of characters outside of those games who many people wanted to play as. Now granted, I didn't have much issue with this approach, partly because it would have exacerbated my bigger gripe with the roster, and the other issue it suffers from being that they went with the most boring and predictable choices from those 3 games. We got the protagonists and other major and plot important characters as you should, but that was about it. Save for Cordelia, we didn't get any of the side characters until the DLC came out. Even though I can think of a bunch of side characters from the featured games who could have been good and fun inclusions, but never made it in at all. Instead, we got every single sibling from Fates, which I thought was unnecessary and took up a big portion of the roster that could have been used to feature more interesting picks and better even out the number of characters between games. And while DLC did fix some of these issues, they did some weird things with it too. Despite the likes of Owain and Navarre appearing in the base game, they were DLC. And they made Majora DLC when she's the freaking deuteragonist of Fates! Even with the too many safe picks problem, she makes way too much sense and still would have been good for the base game at the very least for having a unique moveset. Which takes me over to one other issue with the roster. Crossing over into gameplay here, Warriors also had a lot of clone characters, including for those who definitely should have had original movesets from what they can do in-game. For some examples, why is Farja a clone of Robin when she can use dark magic? Let her use some Dark Tome spells to make her distinct from all the other mages. Similarly, why is Leo a clone of Elise when he has his own separate spells too? And why is Minerva a clone of Camilla when she isn't a Malignite and thus can't use magic? You could have taken out all the magic attacks and focused purely on her axe for a more rushdown style or whatever. And a bunch of these clones were from the DLC, meaning you had to pay extra money to get characters who play exactly the same as ones already in the game. While the core gameplay of Warriors was certainly good if you enjoy Musou games, the weird handling of the characters who made it in did detract from that a little. Now let's see how Free Hopes handled this aspect under all the same criteria. Right off the bat, choosing to focus the game solely on free houses rather than the series as a whole was definitely a better move for the roster, as it helps to manage expectations, so fans know that characters from other games aren't going to appear straight away in a manner that is understandable. This was one of the reasons why I thought this concept would already be an improvement. Another one being that it also gives the opportunity to improve on the predictable plot-important character abundance issue, as with only one game, there isn't that many to include, so we can add in a lot more side characters to fill up the roster for variety. And boy did they do that! So, which students are you planning to include for this game? Everyone! That's right! Every single student from free houses is playable! This already provides a ton more variety in character selection than the original Warriors ever did. And that's not all. Most of the faculty is playable too, and even the Ashen Wolves are here. But Free Hopes also added a bunch of new playable characters, like the real Monica, Rodrigue, and Holst. But most notable of all is the new protagonist, Shez. In Warriors, the OC protagonists were Rowan and Liana, who are frankly the most boring protagonists in all of Fire Emblem. One is all about, I want to be a knight, not a king, and the other, I don't even fucking know. While Shez's personality isn't anything to write home about either, and I'm not a big fan of their design as I think it screams DeviantArt OC, do not steal, they have a way more interesting storyline that helps them to stand out in their own right, possessing some connection to the Agarthans, and thus those who slither in the dark, in which they were born to be the vessel for Arvel, like how Byleth was for Sophis, only with more sinister intentions behind it. Unfortunately, we never learn what the exact connection is, despite how much they tease us with trying to find that answer, but that alone is way more fleshed out than anything they did with Rowan and Liana, even if Arvel is a prick.
We all make a few mistakes along the way. And by we, I mean you. And by a few, I mean far, far more than average.
You keep your fucking voice down!
I think what also helps is that Shez is shown to be a lot more expressive across their support conversations, which makes them appear less one-note. And seeing as I'm on that subject, I'll take a detour to go over the support conversations in general. Warriors did have support conversations too, but you only get these conversations when the two characters reach A-rank support, which made unlocking each one a very time-consuming task. Speaking from personal experience here, from just playing the game normally through the story, I only got Chrom and Robin to A rank to see their support. After beating the game, I practically had to grind for support with characters in the history mode maps over and over until I eventually got tired of doing that and moved on to something else. Which is a shame because many of Warriors' support conversations are well written. It's just the long-winded means to see them made them resultantly harder to appreciate. Meanwhile, Free Hopes' approach to support conversations is pretty much the same as Free Houses. While not all support ranks have a conversation to go with them, the fact that pairs of characters who can go up to B or A rank have their conversations unlocked sooner and or have multiple conversations in their chain means you get to see them interact much more. Also helped by how it's so much easier to build up support in this game. And as for writing, I'd say they're about on par with Free Houses supports. Now with 90% less arguing in the early ranks. And oh my god, they gave Bernadetta and Marianne support conversations. 10 out of 10, Game of the Year, enough said. When it comes to how the roster plays, Free Hopes went a different route by having each character's moveset be tied to their class rather than the character themselves. Meaning two characters of the same class will have the same moveset. So in a way, this game actually has more clones. But it's not as clear-cut as that. While I ideally would have liked everyone to be completely unique, I know that would be such an unrealistically huge feat to achieve, both due to the sheer number of playable characters this time around, and how they carried over Free House's class system of letting you potentially make each character whatever class you want for far more options for the player. Plus, there are still ways that they differentiate from one another, beyond just giving them different weapons and accessories that can have different effects. Each character has their own exclusive skill which translates into a unique move for them in combat, like Byleth using the world. And more importantly, their combat arts they learn from ranking up in their classes and inheriting from support partners can be assigned differently for each of them depending on what you want. So you are able to give two characters with the same class different combat arts and utilize their exclusive skills to give them a slight distinction in how they play. It also helps that there are a few characters with classes unique to them, and thus gives them unique movesets too for slightly less overlap. Now going over the rest of the gameplay, Free Hopes maintains the same core combat and Muso mechanics seen in the original Warriors, so it's still all good there. But Free Hopes introduced a ton of supporting features to aid the combat, which the original didn't really have, sadly. Beyond the standard feature of being able to upgrade characters' abilities, the camp hub world is full of free houses mechanics that have been repurposed to assist the Muso formula, such as battalions that give their assigned characters buffs against certain weapon or enemy types, cooking to provide positive effects to everyone for the rest of the chapter and raise support, volunteering to also raise support and potentially get rewards, and most importantly, the return of tea time for excursions! Once again to raise support. See, I told you it was much easier this time. But those subsequent ones also raise morale with units so that they can deal more damage in combat. This adds a tiny bit of strategy when it comes to choosing who to use for each mission, since it's more beneficial to have your ideal units at max morale so they deal the most damage possible. On top of how to stack against the enemy composition with the dual weapon triangle in this game. Ironically, when it's based off the game that didn't use the weapon triangle. It's not much strategy, but it's at least something. Not to mention the larger variety of enemies in this game from different classes, weapons, and even the usage of demonic beasts and golems for larger mini-boss style enemies when the only such enemy in the original was the final boss. And the last part of this area I wanted to cover is how both games tackle story progression. The original Warriors had a simple beat the level to unlock the next one and continue for its story mode, which wasn't a problem at all, but Free Hopes definitely expanded on that to take it a step forward. In a combination of the history mode from before and Age of Calamity's map, each chapter covers a region of Fodlan that is divided up into smaller regions that have missions that you need to beat in order to capture said region and make your way to the chapter's main story mission like it's some kind of Mario overworld. I would have liked it if this game also had a dedicated challenge mode with more variety in missions and the ability to use whoever you want regardless of route for extra replayability rather than it just being the story. But at the very least, this method fulfills a similar role and gives you the opportunity to train up characters and gather resources to expand camp facilities, among other things, to make your army stronger and more prepared for the chapter's end. Plus, most of them are optional, so you can head straight to story progress ASAP if you want, but I personally didn't. I valued the benefits of capturing regions over the extra renown. And for the final aspect of the two games that need to be covered, and arguably one of the biggest of all in how they differ, the story. I've said before that my biggest issue with the original Warriors was its story due to how bland and underdeveloped it is. Like, I don't go into a Muso game expecting a Shakespearean plot or anything, but even then, Warrior's story felt like less than that of a super watered down Fire Emblem game narrative that lacked any real character conflicts, and when it tried to do that, it got practically solved by cheesy importance of friendship lectures and still felt super hunky-dory 90% of the time. But thankfully, they massively improved on the plot this time around. Not just from obviously carrying over the story elements from Free Houses, but for what it does on its own too. Right off the bat, they already mix things up tremendously by having Byleth be an antagonist for most of the game, and can stay that way for its entirety if you fail to recruit them. Then there's the alterations made to each route. For my first playthrough, I did Scarlet Blaze because I chose Black Eagle as my first time playing Free Houses, alongside recruiting Byleth and Geralt, after many attempts. And I gotta say, it's certainly a much more complete storyline than Crimson Flower. For instance, we actually get Edelgard fighting against those who slither in the dark during the story like what I wanted back then. Not sure why Shez's existence prompted her decision to ditch them during the Academy phase this time, but since it pans out better, I won't complain much. It felt like I wasn't missing out on anything major compared to other routes and getting the short end of the stick by playing this one first. Furthermore, by recruiting Byleth, I unlocked the revelation of Arvel as Epimenides being the true antagonist of the game, giving me all the backstory the game is willing to give us of them wanting to destroy Sophis to supposedly bring balance to Fodlan, and defeating them in this sweet segment where all the house leaders team up. It was really cool getting to play as Dimitri and Claude for a brief period in this route. And if this game didn't already further drive home the grey morality of many of its antagonists through the route structure, seeing their interactions under this temporary truce certainly did. Scarlet Blaze still wasn't perfect. I did have a few gripes with its storyline, like how it kind of wrapped up way too quickly upon reaching the end, and the aforementioned matter of Shez's full backstory never being revealed in any route, but overall it was still good. And for what I've seen of Azure Gleam and Golden Wildfire so far, they appear to be of similar quality, though I'd imagine that those two will likely feel more like downgrades compared to Azure Moon and Verdant Wind respectively, due to those routes already being great, and these ones lacking some of what made them so good, like Crazy Dimitri and the huge lore dump. But as they still carry over many of the other dramatic events of Free House's storyline, like having to kill the students you didn't or can't recruit to guilt trip you, they should still be good on their own. Once again, it's like a diet version of Free House's story, but in this instance, it's more of a good diet alternative. So as a whole, Free Hopes is such a huge improvement over the original Fire Emblem Warriors, taking what worked really well from that game and fixing the weaker aspects while also adding a ton of new features, mechanics, and touch-ups alongside the implementation of Free House's setting to produce something that is far more memorable and unique, which has also seen far more unanimous praise this time around, as opposed to being stuck in Hyrule Warriors Shadow and seen as a lesser version of it. Actually, I think this game is a strong contender against Age of Calamity.
Well. How the turntables...
Though it's unlikely that anything will be added to this game due to the all-story mode structure, what is here is already very much worth it, so it probably doesn't need it. Aside from, you know, that proper backstory. Just saying. So if anything more comes out of Musou and Fire Emblem in this back and forth with Zelda in another 5 years like the time skip, then that future could be looking a lot brighter.